She thought he was just a homeless man in need, until the next day, when she walked into work and saw him in a suit, sitting in the CEO's chair. Now he's about to change her life forever. Section 1. The winter wind cut through the city like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. Snowflakes fluttered down in thick clusters, blanketing the sidewalks and muffling the usual city noise. Sarah Evans tugged her coat tighter around her frame, shivering as she rushed down the nearly empty street. It was late, much later than she had intended to stay at the diner where she worked double shifts just to keep up with her bills. The streetlights cast an eerie glow on the deserted sidewalk, their light reflecting off the slushy snow. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold night air as she hurried toward the subway station, eager to escape the biting wind. But just as she was about to descend the steps, a quiet sound made her pause, a low, hoarse cough. Sarah turned her head toward the sound, her eyes scanning the dark alley between the buildings. At first, she saw nothing but the usual debris, discarded boxes, scraps of old newspaper tumbling in the wind, and an overturned trash bin. But then, in the shadow of a crumbling brick wall, she spotted him. A man sat hunched over, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket that was woefully inadequate against the brutal cold. His face was buried in his arms, his entire body trembling violently. His clothes were worn and stained, his boots caked with dirt. He looked half frozen. Sarah hesitated. She had seen homeless people on the streets before, plenty of them. It wasn't that she didn't care, but she had learned to keep walking. The city was full of people struggling to survive, and she was barely making it herself. She couldn't help everyone, but something about this man made her pause. Maybe it was the way he shivered uncontrollably. Maybe it was the way he sat there, completely still, as if he had already given up. Or maybe it was because, beneath the grime and disheveled hair, he looked strangely out of place, like he didn't belong there. Her conscience gnawed at her, refusing to let her walk away. With a sigh, Sarah took a step forward. "Hey," she called out gently. The man didn't move. She took another step closer, her boots crunching softly in the snow. "Sir?" This time he stirred. Slowly, he lifted his head, revealing tired, piercing gray eyes that locked onto hers. His face was gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and a shadow of stubble. Despite his exhaustion, his gaze held a quiet intensity that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "I don't have anything," he rasped, his voice rough from the cold. Sarah shook her head. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. You look like you could use some help." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked by indifference. "I'm fine." Sarah almost laughed at that. He was anything but fine. "You're freezing," she pointed out. "You need somewhere warm to stay." The man didn't answer, only looking away as if he didn't expect her to keep talking. She exhaled slowly, glancing at the diner in the distance. "Look, I work at that place down the street. They let me take leftover food sometimes. If you come with me, I can get you something hot to eat. Maybe some coffee." For a long moment he didn't respond. The wind howled around them, but he remained perfectly still. Just when she thought he might refuse again, he gave a small nod. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. "All right," she said, trying to smile. "Let's go." She led him back to the diner, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? How had he ended up on the streets? And why, despite his ragged appearance, did he carry himself with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't belong to a homeless man? She didn't have the answers, but somehow she had a feeling this wasn't just an ordinary encounter. Inside the diner, the warmth was a stark contrast to the freezing cold outside. The old heating system groaned softly, but it was enough to chase the chill from her bones. Sarah guided the man to a corner booth, watching as he hesitated before sitting down. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a steaming plate of soup, a thick sandwich, and a cup of hot coffee. "Here," she said, placing the food in front of him. He stared at it for a long time before finally picking up the spoon. He ate slowly at first, as if testing whether the food was real, then gradually picked up speed, as though his body had suddenly remembered what it meant to be fed. Sarah sat across from him, resting her chin on her hand as she watched him eat. "You have a name?" she asked after a while. The man hesitated. "Nathaniel," he finally said. Nathaniel. It suited him. It sounded refined, proper, completely unlike someone who was living on the streets. "I'm Sarah," she offered. "So, Nathaniel, how'd you end up out there?" He paused, setting his spoon down. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he exhaled, his fingers curling around the coffee mug. "Bad luck," he said simply. Sarah arched a brow. "That's vague." A ghost of a smile played at his lips. It was barely there, but it softened his harsh features for the briefest moment. Life doesn't always go as planned. Sarah could relate to that. She had dreamed of becoming an artist, of seeing the world, of doing something more than just scraping by in a small diner. But life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges in the way. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know what you mean." For a while they sat in silence. Then, as if remembering something, Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing an ID card. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, because the ID card didn't belong to a homeless man. It belonged to a CEO. Her eyes darted from the name on the card, Nathaniel Blackwood, to the man sitting in front of her. It couldn't be. Nathaniel Blackwood was the billionaire CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, one of the most powerful business empires in the country. His face had been in the news multiple times. He was one of the most sought-after investors in the world. And yet, here he was, sitting in a small diner, dressed in rags, looking at her with quiet amusement. Sarah's mind reeled. "What?" she swallowed. "What is this? Is this real?" Nathaniel took a sip of his coffee before replying. "Real enough," he murmured. Sarah gaped at him. "You're telling me you're—" "Yes," he said, cutting her off. "But that's not important right now." "Not important," she echoed, stunned. "You're a billionaire sitting in my diner after I found you freezing on the street. How is that not important?" Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Because," he said slowly, "I needed to see something." Sarah's pulse quickened. "See what? If kindness still exists," he said. Sarah stared at him, speechless. "Consider this a test," he continued. "And you, Sarah Evans, just passed it." She had no idea what that meant, but something told her that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined, and she had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. Section 2. Sarah's mind was spinning. The man she had found freezing in an alley, the man she had fed at her diner, was not just some unfortunate stranger. He was Nathaniel Blackwood, the billionaire CEO known for his ruthless business strategies and enigmatic presence in the corporate world. She stared at him, still trying to process the absurdity of the situation. This doesn't make any sense." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, watching her with quiet amusement. "What doesn't make sense?" Sarah let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "Everything. You, Nathaniel Blackwood, are one of the richest men in the country. Why the hell were you freezing on the streets?" Nathaniel took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I was conducting an experiment." She frowned. "An experiment?" "I wanted to see something," he said, leaning back against the worn-out diner booth. "Something money can't buy." Sarah crossed her arms. "And what exactly were you hoping to find?" "Pity?" His lips twitched as if amused by her defiance. "Number kindness." She narrowed her eyes. "You wanted to see if people would help a homeless man?" "Something like that." Sarah exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This had to be some kind of joke, some elaborate test for his own amusement. She had met wealthy men before, well, not this wealthy, but she had seen enough to know how they worked. They were selfish, arrogant, and used their money as a shield against the real world. And yet, Nathaniel didn't seem like them. He had let himself suffer in the cold just to see if someone would help him. And the worst part? No one had, except her. Sarah swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. "And what did you learn?" Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he placed his wallet back into his pocket and said, "That there's still hope." His words sent an odd warmth through her chest, but she quickly shoved it aside. "So what happens now?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you going to write a check for me? Say, 'Congratulations, Sarah, you passed my morality test,' and drive off in your limo?" Nathaniel smirked. "Do you want a check?" She huffed. "No." "Good," he said, setting his coffee cup down. "Because I have a better idea." A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. "And what's that?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his piercing gray eyes locking onto hers. "I want you to work for me." Silence stretched between them. Sarah blinked, then blinked again. What?" "I want you to come work at Blackwood Enterprises." She let out a breathless laugh, completely thrown off. "Are you insane?" He smiled slightly. Not that I'm aware of. Why would you offer me a job? She asked, genuinely baffled. I'm a waitress, not some corporate genius. Because I need people I can trust, he said simply. And you, Sarah, just proved you're one of them. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because deep down, a part of her was intrigued. She had spent years working paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by. A job at Blackwood Enterprises could change her life, but it also meant stepping into a world she didn't belong in. Sarah hesitated. I don't know anything about business. Nathaniel's lips twitched. Then it's a good thing I'm willing to teach you. Sarah exhaled, staring at the man sitting across from her. He was still wearing tattered clothes, still looking like a homeless man, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. This was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and for some reason, he wanted her. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. After Nathaniel left, she sat alone in the empty diner, replaying their conversation over and over in her mind. It was insane. Completely, utterly insane. But so was finding a billionaire disguised as a homeless man in an alley. The next morning, she woke up to a knock on her apartment door. Still groggy, she shuffled across the tiny living room, rubbing her eyes before swinging the door open. Her breath caught. Nathaniel Blackwood stood in the hallway, but he didn't look like the man from last night. He was freshly showered, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair neatly styled. He had shaved, revealing a chiseled jawline that belonged on a magazine cover. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. Good morning, he said smoothly, as if this was a completely normal situation. Sarah snapped out of her daze. What the hell are you doing here? Nathaniel lifted an eyebrow. You didn't call. She gaped at him. You expected me to call? I made you a job offer. She scoffed. People don't just accept job offers from billionaires overnight. Nathaniel smirked. Most people would. Sarah groaned, rubbing her temple. You're not going to let this go, are you? Not a chance. She sighed. I have a shift in an hour. Nathaniel's expression didn't change. Not anymore. Her brows furrowed. What do you mean? I spoke to your manager. He tucked his hands into his pockets, his voice casual. You no longer work there. Her heart stopped. You what? I bought the diner, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sarah stared at him. You bought the entire diner? Nathaniel nodded. It was easier than waiting for you to quit. Her mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't sure whether to scream or laugh. You can't just do that, she finally sputtered. He tilted his head. Why not? Sarah groaned, pressing her palms against her face. Because normal people don't go around buying restaurants just to make someone work for them. Nathaniel chuckled. I'm not normal. Sarah dragged a hand down her face. What the hell had she gotten herself into? She crossed her arms. And if I say no? Nathaniel stepped closer, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Then you're making the worst decision of your life. The air between them was charged. Sarah swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how close he was standing. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him to leave, but deep down, she knew he was right. Taking this job meant stepping into the unknown, but it also meant finally getting a chance at something more. With a long breath, she met his gaze, and then, against all logic, she said, Fine. A slow smile spread across Nathaniel's lips. Good choice, he murmured. And just like that, Sarah Evans' life changed forever. Section 3. Sarah spent the next 48 hours questioning every decision she had ever made. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the sleek contract Nathaniel had handed her. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of her entire future. A job at Blackwood Enterprises. Her, a waitress with zero business experience, stepping into one of the most powerful corporations in the country. This had to be some kind of sick joke. But no, Nathaniel was serious. She had spent the previous evening pacing her apartment, running through all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. 1. She didn't belong in his world. 2. She didn't trust him. 3. He bought her damn diner. That last one still made her want to strangle him. And yet, despite everything, a small part of her was intrigued. Nathaniel Blackwood was one of the richest, most powerful men in the country, and for some insane reason, he had decided she was worth his time. She didn't know if that was flattering or terrifying. Maybe both. By the time morning came, she had made up her mind. She was going. If nothing else, she had to see what the hell he was up to. Walking into Blackwood Enterprises felt like stepping into another universe. The towering glass skyscraper was impossibly sleek, stretching high above the city. The sheer size of the building made her stomach churn. What was she even doing here? A security guard in a crisp navy uniform glanced at her. "Can I help you, miss?" Sarah clutched the contract in her hands, suddenly feeling like a complete fraud. She cleared her throat. "I'm here for Nathaniel Blackwood." The man barely blinked. "Name?" "Sarah Evans." The moment she said it, the guard's expression changed. He quickly straightened, pressing his earpiece. "She's here," he murmured. A few seconds later, the sleek glass elevator across the lobby dinged open. Sarah had a bad feeling. Before she could react, a man in a three-piece suit stepped forward, giving her a once-over with sharp, assessing eyes. "You must be Miss Evans." His voice was smooth, but there was something rigid about him, like he was always 2 seconds away from ordering someone's execution. Sarah swallowed. Yeah? I'm Mr. Grant, Mr. Blackwood's executive assistant." He motioned toward the elevator. "Follow me." The elevator ride was silent. Sarah clutched the contract tighter, trying to ignore the intimidating presence of Mr. Grant beside her. Her reflection in the polished metal doors stared back at her. Messy hair, a second-hand blouse that didn't quite fit, worn-out jeans. She looked completely out of place, and then, ding! The elevator doors slid open, revealing an office so absurdly luxurious it didn't even feel real. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive mahogany desk overlooking the city skyline, dark leather furniture. Everything screamed money, and in the middle of it all, Nathaniel Blackwood. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, his perfectly tailored charcoal suit making him look every bit the ruthless billionaire. Sarah's stomach flipped. He turned, their eyes met. "Good," Nathaniel said smoothly, his lips twitching slightly. "You came." Sarah hated how annoyingly attractive he was. She squared her shoulders. "For now." His smirk deepened. Mr. Grant cleared his throat. "I've prepared the paperwork, sir." Nathaniel nodded. "Leave us." The assistant hesitated for half a second, but then bowed slightly and exited without another word. Sarah exhaled sharply. "Jesus, do you train them to be that terrifying?" Nathaniel's lips twitched. "It's part of the job description." She rolled her eyes. "Of course it is." Nathaniel stepped closer, his gaze flicking down to the contract in her hands. "You read it?" Sarah hesitated. "Yeah. And?" She crossed her arms. "I have questions." Nathaniel smirked. "I'm sure you do." She shot him a glare. "You want me to be your special assistant?" "Yes." Sarah exhaled. "Why?" Nathaniel was silent for a moment. Then slowly, he stepped closer. "Because I want you here, Sarah." Her breath hitched. His voice was lower now, smoother, like he was testing her reaction. Sarah's pulse spiked. She forced herself to ignore it. "Yeah, well, I don't know anything about being an assistant to a billionaire," she muttered. Nathaniel's lips curved. "I'll teach you." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "You really think I can do this?" His gaze softened slightly. "I think you're smarter than you realize." Something about his tone made her stomach tighten. She didn't want to admit it, but a small part of her wanted to believe him. After a long moment, she exhaled. "Fine." Nathaniel smiled. "Welcome to Blackwood Enterprises, Miss Evans." Sarah had a terrible feeling she had just made a deal with the devil. The next 2 weeks were hell. Nathaniel wasn't kidding when he said she'd need training. From the second she arrived, she was thrown into a whirlwind of meetings, schedules, and phone calls. She learned how to organize million-dollar deals, how to manage corporate chaos. She learned that Nathaniel Blackwood was a nightmare. He didn't tolerate mistakes, he expected perfection. And yet, he was always patient with her, and he never yelled, never made her feel stupid. He pushed her hard, but never too far. And somehow, she started to enjoy the challenge. She started to keep up. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, Sarah collapsed onto the couch in her office, rubbing her temples. She was exhausted. "Rough day." She jumped, turning to see Nathaniel leaning against the doorway. She groaned. "Do you sneak up on people for fun?" His lips twitched. "Only you." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Lucky me." Nathaniel stepped inside, holding out a glass of wine. Sarah blinked. "What's this?" "A peace offering." She eyed him suspiciously, but took it. Nathaniel sat across from her, swirling his own glass. "You did well today." Sarah hesitated. "I messed up that investor call." He smirked. "Not as badly as you think." She sighed. This job is insane. Nathaniel chuckled. Welcome to my world. Sarah exhaled, taking a sip of wine. I still don't get why you hired me. Nathaniel was silent for a moment, then finally he said, Because you remind me of someone I used to know. Sarah frowned. Who? He studied her for a long moment. Then quietly he said, Someone who believed people deserved a second chance. The air between them shifted. Sarah's stomach fluttered. For the first time since she met him, Nathaniel Blackwood didn't seem untouchable, and that terrified her more than anything. Section 4. Sarah had spent her entire life making cautious, calculated choices. She didn't take unnecessary risks. She didn't dive into things she didn't understand. But working for Nathaniel Blackwood? This was a risk. Every day she walked into his glass-walled office and felt like she was stepping into a battlefield, one where she wasn't sure if she was fighting against him or beside him. She wanted to keep things professional. She wanted to remind herself that she was just an employee, that this was nothing more than a job. But Nathaniel made it impossible. One afternoon, she was sorting through files in his office when she caught him watching her. She froze. He was leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, his sharp gaze tracking her every move. Sarah felt her pulse jump. Do I have something on my face? She muttered, flipping a folder shut. Nathaniel smirked. Not at all. She narrowed her eyes. Then why are you staring at me? His gaze darkened. You're fascinating to watch. Sarah's stomach twisted. Nope. She refused to let this man, this ridiculously attractive, frustratingly powerful man, get under her skin. So she rolled her eyes and shot back, well, if you have time to sit around staring at people, maybe I should give you more work. Nathaniel actually chuckled, and for some reason the sound of it sent a strange, tingling warmth through her. God, this was dangerous. The real problem started when the rumors began. Sarah had just finished reviewing Nathaniel's schedule for the week when she overheard two executives whispering in the hallway. She's different from the others, one of them murmured. Obviously, have you seen the way he looks at her? Sarah's stomach dropped. The way he looks at me? She hurried past them, pretending she hadn't heard a word, but the damage was already done. The whispers didn't stop. Everywhere she went, she caught glances. People talked, speculated, and suddenly she wasn't just Nathaniel Blackwood's assistant. She was the woman everyone thought he was interested in. That night, she stayed late at the office, hoping to clear her head. She was exhausted. She just wanted one moment of peace, but Nathaniel had other plans. He knocked once before stepping into her office. Sarah barely glanced up. It's late, shouldn't you be at some billionaire gala? Nathaniel smirked. And miss watching you stress out over paperwork? Never. Sarah sighed. What do you want, Blackwood? Nathaniel leaned against the desk, his gaze unreadable. I heard the rumors. Sarah stiffened. Oh. He tilted his head. They don't bother you. They did, more than she wanted to admit, but she forced herself to shrug. People always gossip about their bosses, it's nothing. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then suddenly he reached out, his fingers brushing against her chin, tilting her face toward him. Sarah's breath caught. Are you sure it's nothing? His voice was lower now, smoother. She swallowed, hard. Her heart pounded. She needed to get out of here. Sarah pulled away quickly, standing up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. I should go, she muttered. She grabbed her bag, rushed past him, and bolted for the elevator. She didn't stop moving until she was outside, gulping in the cool night air. What the hell was happening? The next morning, Sarah tried to act normal. She walked into work, head held high, pretending like she hadn't nearly had a heart attack in Nathaniel's office the night before. She was fine. Everything was fine. But then she walked into Nathaniel's office and he was already waiting for her. Sarah hesitated. You're in early. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, smirking. So are you. Sarah clenched her jaw. Okay, two could play this game. She squared her shoulders, tossed his schedule onto the desk and said, Your morning meeting starts in 10 minutes. Nathaniel studied her, amusement flickering in his eyes. No good morning? Sarah forced a tight smile. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. He chuckled. She wanted to punch him. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Nathaniel was still intimidating, still ruthless, but he was also different. He listened to her. He actually valued her opinions. He started bringing her coffee in the mornings, always the exact way she liked it, with 2 sugars and a dash of cinnamon. Sarah pretended not to notice, but she did. One night, she was finishing up some work when she felt a jacket being draped over her shoulders. She turned, startled, only to see Nathaniel standing behind her. "You looked cold," he said simply. Sarah stared at him. She should have shrugged it off. She should have handed the jacket back, but for some reason she didn't. She just let it stay. She should have known then. She was in trouble. The final straw came at a charity gala. Sarah didn't even want to go, but Nathaniel insisted. And now she regretted everything, because he looked dangerously good in a tux. And worse, she was hyper-aware of him the entire night. At one point she excused herself, escaping to the balcony. She needed air, but moments later she heard footsteps behind her. "You're avoiding me." Sarah stiffened. "I'm not." Nathaniel chuckled. "Liar." She exhaled sharply. "Why do you care?" Silence, and then quietly he said, "Because I can't stop thinking about you." Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned slowly. "Nathaniel." But before she could finish, he reached for her. His fingers brushed against her cheek, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't mix business with personal," she whispered. Nathaniel's gaze darkened. "Neither do I," he murmured. "But with you, I want to break every rule." Sarah felt her entire world tilt. She should walk away, she should say no, but instead, she just stood there, and for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do. Section 5. Sarah had spent her entire life maintaining control. She had rules, boundaries she didn't cross, lines she didn't blur. And right now, standing on the balcony with Nathaniel Blackwood looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered, she felt dangerously close to breaking them. His fingers were still resting against her cheek, his touch too warm, too familiar. She should step back and she should end this, but she didn't move. Because for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to. The moment stretched between them, heavy and charged, the city lights reflecting in Nathaniel's dark eyes. His voice was low, steady. "Tell me to walk away, and I will." Sarah swallowed. She knew she should, and she had to, but the words wouldn't come. Nathaniel took a slow step forward. Sarah's breath hitched. The space between them vanished. And just when she thought he was about to close the distance, someone called his name. Nathaniel's jaw tensed. Sarah snapped out of it. She turned away so fast it made her dizzy, clutching the railing like it could keep her grounded. What was she doing? Nathaniel sighed, low and frustrated. "Sarah." She forced herself to move. "I have to go." She didn't wait for him to respond. She hurried past him, ignoring the way her pulse raced and her hands shook. This was a mistake she could not afford to make. The next day, Sarah did everything in her power to avoid him. She arrived at the office earlier than usual, buried herself in work, and refused to look in his direction whenever he walked past. It was childish, but she didn't care. She needed space, she needed distance, except Nathaniel wasn't having it, because by noon he had already caught on to her plan, and he was done playing along. "Sarah." She froze. Nathaniel was standing by her desk, his sharp gaze locked onto her. Her heart dropped. "I need you in my office." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but then she saw the look in his eyes. Serious, determined. And she knew right then and there that she wasn't getting out of this. She sighed. Fine. She followed him inside, her stomach a mess of nerves. As soon as the door shut behind them, Nathaniel turned to face her. Sarah folded her arms. "What is this about?" she asked, feigning indifference. Nathaniel leaned against his desk. "You've been avoiding me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "I have not." Nathaniel raised a brow. She glared. "You're imagining things, Blackwood." He sighed, shaking his head. "You're a terrible liar." Sarah's stomach tightened. Because he was right and she wasn't lying. She was running, and the worst part? Nathaniel knew it. She tried to play it off, to pretend like nothing had happened. But Nathaniel wasn't backing down. His voice was low when he said, "Talk to me, Sarah." She exhaled sharply. "There's nothing to talk about." He stepped closer. Her pulse jumped. "Are you sure?" he murmured. Sarah clenched her jaw. This wasn't fair. He was too close, too intense, and too much. And the worst part? She didn't know if she wanted to run away or pull him closer. So she did the only thing she could. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to say, "This can't happen." Nathaniel froze. For the first time, his expression wavered. Then slowly he said, "Why not?" Sarah's heart twisted. Why not? Because she had worked too hard to build a life for herself. Because she had spent years being independent, careful, guarded, because she had seen what happened when people let their hearts rule their decisions, and she refused to let it happen to her, because if she let herself fall for Nathaniel Blackwood, she wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to walk away. Nathaniel must have seen something in her expression, because his eyes softened. He sighed. Then, in the gentlest voice she'd ever heard from him, he said, "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah." Her breath hitched. She looked away. "Then don't," she whispered. Silence, and then Nathaniel stepped back. Sarah's heart dropped. For some reason, she hadn't expected him to actually listen, but he did. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I won't push," he said, "but I'm not giving up either." Sarah's stomach twisted. He didn't wait for her response. He just nodded once and walked past her, leaving her standing alone in his office, heart pounding, mind spinning. She had no idea what to do, but deep down she knew one thing for certain. Nathaniel Blackwood was not a man who gave up easily, and whether she was ready for it or not, this wasn't over. Section 6. Sarah had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people at a distance. She knew how to smile politely, how to deflect personal questions, how to keep the walls up so high that no one even thought to climb them. But Nathaniel Blackwood, he was scaling them like they were nothing, and she had no idea how to stop him. The tension between them had only grown since their last conversation. Nathaniel had kept his promise. He didn't push, didn't corner her, didn't demand anything, but that didn't mean he had given up, because every time she turned around, he was there. A lingering glance in the hallway, a knowing smirk when their hands brushed, a quiet "Good night, Sarah," spoken in a voice that made her heart skip a beat. It was infuriating, because it was working. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him, and she was running out of excuses. By the time Friday rolled around, Sarah was at her breaking point. She needed space and she needed distance. She needed to remind herself why this was a bad idea. So when Emma invited her out for drinks after work, she didn't hesitate. She needed a distraction, and a night out with her best friend. That sounded like the perfect solution, or at least it did at the time, because what Sarah didn't know was that Nathaniel Blackwood had plans of his own. The bar was packed, loud music, dim lighting, the scent of liquor and cheap cologne filling the air. Sarah wasn't a big drinker, but tonight she made an exception. She needed one, maybe two, maybe three. Emma grinned as Sarah took a sip of her cocktail. "So," she said, wiggling her brows, "are we going to talk about it?" Sarah blinked. "Talk about what?" Emma scoffed. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the fact that you've been walking around like a woman on the verge of a meltdown all week?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." Emma leaned in, smirking. "Am I?" Sarah sighed. "It's nothing." Emma snorted. "It's definitely something." Sarah took another sip of her drink, avoiding eye contact, because she knew Emma wouldn't drop it. Not until she got answers. "Fine," Sarah muttered. "It's Nathaniel." Emma's eyes widened. Sarah immediately regretted saying anything. "Oh my God," Emma gasped. You like him?" Sarah nearly choked. "I do not." Emma grinned. "You totally do." Sarah glared. "I do not." Emma just smirked. "Sure, babe, keep telling yourself that." Sarah groaned. "I'm serious." Emma shrugged. "So am I." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. This was not helping. She had come here to forget about Nathaniel, not to have a full-blown intervention. And then it happened. Emma was in the middle of teasing her again when she suddenly stopped. Her eyes widened. Sarah frowned. "What?" Emma didn't respond. She just tilted her head toward the entrance. Sarah followed her gaze and froze, because standing by the door, dressed in a crisp black suit, looking like he owned the damn place, was Nathaniel Blackwood. Her stomach dropped. She couldn't breathe. What was he doing here? Their eyes met across the room. Nathaniel's lips curved into a slow, knowing smirk. Sarah's pulse raced. She grabbed Emma's arm. "We need to leave." Emma snorted. "Oh, babe, you're not going anywhere." Sarah swore under her breath that this was not good. Not good at all. Nathaniel made his way toward her like a predator stalking its prey. Confident, unbothered, in control. Sarah's throat went dry, and then he was standing right in front of her, close enough to touch, close enough to drive her insane. "Sarah," he murmured. She swallowed. "Nathaniel." His smirk deepened. Emma looked between them, grinning. "I should probably go." Sarah panicked. No, you shouldn't. Emma laughed. Oh, but I really, really should. And then she left, leaving Sarah alone with Nathaniel, her worst nightmare, her biggest temptation, all wrapped into one. Nathaniel tilted his head. You didn't tell me you were going out tonight. Sarah crossed her arms. I didn't know I needed your permission. Nathaniel chuckled. You don't. His gaze flickered over her outfit. Sarah's stomach tightened. You look beautiful. Her breath hitched. She hated that her body reacted to him so easily. She hated that a single look from him could make her knees go weak. She hated that he had this much power over her. So she did the only thing she could. She forced herself to push him away. Why are you here? She asked. Nathaniel took a sip of his drink. I was curious. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Curious about what? Nathaniel smiled, slow and deliberate. About why you keep running from me. Sarah's heart pounded. She refused to let him see how much he affected her. She refused to let him win. So she lifted her chin and said, I'm not running. Nathaniel's gaze darkened. He leaned in, voice low and teasing. Then why are you trembling? Sarah stiffened because he was right. Her hands were shaking, her pulse was wild, and she had no idea what to do about it. Nathaniel must have sensed her hesitation because his expression softened. Relax, Sarah, he murmured. Her breath shook. I'm not going to do anything you don't want me to. Sarah exhaled, but it wasn't relief she felt. It was frustration. Because what if she did want him to do something? What if she was tired of fighting this? What if she was tired of pretending? Nathaniel reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Sarah's skin burned beneath his touch. And suddenly, she realized she had two choices. She could keep lying to herself, or she could finally admit the truth, that she didn't want to run anymore, that she didn't want to fight this, and that maybe, just maybe, she was falling for Nathaniel Blackwood, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Section 7. Sarah wasn't sure how it happened. One minute she was sitting across from Nathaniel, convincing herself that she was immune to him. The next, she was outside, beneath the soft glow of city lights, alone with the man she had spent weeks trying to avoid. She should have left, she should have walked away, but instead, she stayed. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. The streets were alive with energy, cars speeding past, laughter spilling from nearby bars, the faint hum of a street performer's guitar echoing in the distance. And yet Sarah barely noticed any of it, because all she could focus on was him. Nathaniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, looking as composed as ever, like he hadn't just turned her world upside down, like he wasn't aware of the war raging inside her. But she knew better. She knew he felt it too. Are you going to say something? She asked, breaking the silence. Nathaniel glanced at her, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Are you? Sarah huffed. You're impossible. Nathaniel chuckled. I've been told that before. She rolled her eyes, shoving her hands into her coat pockets. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but this quiet, lingering tension between them was starting to mess with her head. Nathaniel took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. Tell me something, Sarah. She swallowed. What? His voice was low, steady. Why did you help me that night? Sarah stiffened. She should have seen this coming. The question had been hanging between them since the moment she found out who he really was. She had never given him an answer. And now he was demanding one. She took a breath. Because you looked like you needed help. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. That's it? Sarah frowned. Why else would I have done it? Nathaniel took another step closer. Maybe because deep down you saw something in me that reminded you of yourself. Sarah's pulse spiked. She shook her head. You're reaching. Am I? Yes. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed. Fine, he said. If you don't want to talk about it, I won't push. Sarah blinked. You won't? Nathaniel smirked. Number. But that doesn't mean I'll stop trying. Sarah groaned. You're infuriating. And yet you're still here. She hated that he was right. A comfortable silence settled between them. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the past few weeks pressing down on her. She had spent so long running from Nathaniel, from the way he made her feel, but for what? Because if she was being honest, she was tired of pretending, tired of fighting the inevitable, tired of denying the truth. So she did something reckless, something she had been too afraid to do before. She looked at Nathaniel, really looked at him, and whispered, "I'm scared." Nathaniel's expression softened. "Of what?" Sarah hesitated. "Of this," she admitted. "Of whatever this is between us." Nathaniel nodded. "Me too." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that. Hadn't expected him to admit it, but now that he had, now that the words were out there, she wasn't sure what to do next. Nathaniel shifted closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be scared, Sarah." She wanted to believe him. She really, really did. But life had taught her that things never worked out the way you wanted them to. And Nathaniel, he was too dangerous, and not in the way that meant she was in physical danger. No, he was dangerous in a way that threatened everything she had spent years building. Her walls, her control, her ability to keep her heart protected. And yet, she still wanted him. A cool breeze swept past them, carrying the scent of the city. Nathaniel reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. A simple touch, but it sent electricity shooting down her spine. And for the first time since this whole thing began, Sarah let herself wonder, what if she stopped fighting him? What if she let him in? What if, just this once, she let herself feel? Nathaniel must have sensed her hesitation because his voice was gentle when he spoke. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "But just think about it, okay?" Sarah looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, but there was none, just genuine sincerity. And that, more than anything else, was what scared her the most, because if Nathaniel was being honest, then maybe, just maybe, she was already in deeper than she realized. "Okay," she finally whispered. Nathaniel's lips curved into a slow smile. "Good." And just like that, the moment was over. But something had shifted between them, something Sarah couldn't take back. And as she watched Nathaniel walk away, she realized she didn't want to, because for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't running, not anymore. Section 8. Sarah should have been working. She should have been focused on the endless reports sitting on her desk, on the upcoming meetings, on anything other than the way her heart was still racing from the night before. But how could she possibly focus when Nathaniel Blackwood was everywhere? He was in the emails filling her inbox. He was in the meetings where he sat across from her, watching her with a gaze that sent shivers down her spine. He was in her head, replaying every moment of their conversation beneath the city lights. And worst of all, he was winning. She had spent weeks keeping him at a distance, weeks reminding herself that men like Nathaniel Blackwood were not to be trusted. But last night, she had let her guard down. She had let him in. And now, she had no idea what to do next. "Sarah, are you listening?" Her head snapped up. Across the table, Mark, the company's head of PR, was staring at her expectantly. So was everyone else in the meeting. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "Of course," she lied. Mark arched an eyebrow. "Right. Then what do you think about Blackwood Enterprises' new media strategy?" Blackwood Enterprises. Of course, even when she was trying to focus, Nathaniel still found a way to intrude. Sarah sighed, sitting up straighter. "I think we should be careful," she said. "Nathaniel Blackwood might be charming, but we can't let that cloud our judgment. If we move forward with his plan, we need ironclad contracts in place." Mark nodded. "That makes sense." But someone else in the room chuckled. Sarah's stomach dropped, because she knew that laugh. She turned slowly, and found herself face to face with Nathaniel himself, sitting at the head of the table, smirking at her, like he knew exactly what he was doing to her. "Please," Nathaniel said, resting his chin on his hand. "Don't hold back on my account." Sarah's pulse spiked. She had not been expecting him to be here. Sure, she had known this was a meeting about Blackwood Enterprises, his company, but she had assumed one of his many assistants would handle it. Not him. Not the man she had spent the night before nearly giving in to. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "I wasn't holding back," she said smoothly. "I was simply stating facts." Nathaniel chuckled. "And here I thought you were starting to warm up to me." The nerve of this man. Sarah clenched her jaw. "You might be our company's most important investor," she said, "but that doesn't mean I have to trust you blindly." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. For a moment he didn't say anything. The room fell silent, and then he leaned forward, voice dropping just enough for only her to hear. "I don't want your blind trust," he murmured. "I want the real thing." Sarah's breath caught, but before she could respond, Nathaniel turned back to the rest of the room and moved on like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just flipped her world upside down. Again, the meeting dragged on. Or maybe it was just Sarah's mind playing tricks on her. Either way, by the time it ended, she was ready to run. She gathered her things quickly, keeping her gaze firmly ahead as she made her way toward the door. But before she could escape, Nathaniel's voice stopped her. "Sarah, a word." "Damn it." She paused, swallowing hard before turning around. Mark and the other employees were already filing out of the room, casting curious glances in their direction. But Nathaniel didn't care. He was already standing, sliding his hands into his pockets, waiting for her to approach. She took a steadying breath. Then she walked back to him. As soon as the last employee left and the door shut behind them, Nathaniel spoke. "You're avoiding me." Sarah scoffed. "I'm working." Nathaniel smirked. "And yet your mind was somewhere else the entire meeting." Her jaw tightened, because unfortunately he was right, and he knew it. Sarah exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel stepped closer, not enough to touch her, but enough for the air between them to crackle with tension. "I want you to stop pretending," he said. Sarah frowned. "Pretending?" "Yes." Nathaniel's gaze locked onto hers, intense and unwavering. "Pretending that nothing happened last night. Pretending that you don't feel this." Sarah's pulse spiked, but she forced herself to hold her ground. "Nathaniel, last night was just a conversation, that's all." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Was it?" Sarah froze because his voice, his tone, made it impossible to lie, and worse, the way he was looking at her like he could see through every single one of her defenses, made her want to tell the truth, but she couldn't. Not when she still didn't know what he wanted from her. Not when she was still trying to figure out what she wanted from him. So instead, she straightened her shoulders. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice steady, "you don't know anything about me." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "You're right," he admitted. Sarah blinked. "I am." "Yes?" Nathaniel's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "But that doesn't mean I don't want to." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Before she could respond, Nathaniel stepped past her, heading for the door. But just as he reached it, he glanced over his shoulder. "One more thing, Sarah," he said. She swallowed. "What?" His eyes gleamed. "You can keep fighting this all you want," he murmured, "but we both know how this story ends." And with that, he was gone, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the empty conference room, her heart pounding. Because the worst part? She had a feeling he was right, and that terrified her more than anything else. Section 9. Sarah had spent her entire career learning how to remain professional under pressure. She had survived cutthroat business meetings, managed impossible deadlines, and even navigated office politics that would have made others quit. But nothing had ever prepared her for dealing with Nathaniel Blackwood, because how was she supposed to keep things professional when every interaction with him felt like a game of chess she was slowly losing? For the rest of the day, Sarah did everything she could to avoid him. She took the back stairwell instead of the main elevator. She scheduled her lunch break when she knew he'd be in a meeting. She even stayed late just to make sure he was gone before she left. But it didn't matter, because the moment she thought she had escaped him, Nathaniel found a way to remind her that he was still there. Whether it was an unexpected email, a passing glance in the hallway, or a subtle smirk from across the office, he was always watching. And Sarah hated that it made her pulse race. By the time she finally left the office, the city was already bathed in the golden glow of sunset. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, her mind still spinning with everything that had happened. The way Nathaniel had looked at her, the way he had challenged her, the way he had promised that she couldn't fight this forever. She shook her head, frustrated. She refused to be one of those women who let a man like him mess with her head. She had worked too hard to build a life for herself. She wasn't about to let Nathaniel Blackwood become a distraction. And yet, as she stepped onto the quiet street and turned the corner toward her apartment, she froze, because standing there, leaning casually against a sleek black car, was Nathaniel, waiting for her, like he knew she would come this way. Sarah immediately turned on her heel. Nope, not happening. But before she could take 2 steps, Nathaniel's voice reached her, running away again. Damn him. She paused, took a deep breath, then turned back around, lifting her chin. "I'm not running," she said. Nathaniel smirked. Then why do you look guilty? Sarah clenched her jaw. Why are you here? Nathaniel pushed off the car, sliding his hands into his pockets. I wanted to see you, he admitted. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to let him see the effect he had on her. So you just decided to wait outside my apartment? She challenged. Nathaniel's gaze darkened with amusement. Would you have answered if I called? Sarah didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. And the worst part? So did he. Nathaniel sighed, tilting his head. Let me take you to dinner. Sarah blinked. Then she laughed. You're kidding. Nathaniel shook his head. Not at all. Sarah crossed her arms. So, let me get this straight. You ambushed me outside my apartment after a day of playing mind games, and now you think I'm just going to say yes to having dinner with you? Nathaniel grinned. That about sums it up. Sarah narrowed her eyes. You're impossible. Nathaniel took a step closer, and suddenly the space between them felt too small. I'm persistent, he corrected. She wanted to say no, she should say no, but something about the way he was looking at her made her pulse skip, made her hesitate, and that hesitation, it was all the invitation Nathaniel needed. Just one dinner, Nathaniel said, his voice smooth as silk. Sarah looked at him warily. What's your angle? Nathaniel chuckled. Maybe I just want to spend time with you. Sarah arched an eyebrow. And maybe pigs fly. Nathaniel smirked. Would it really be so terrible? Sarah sighed. She hated that part of her was tempted, hated that she was even considering it. But she was tired of fighting him, tired of pretending she wasn't curious, and so finally, she rolled her eyes. One dinner, she said firmly. Nathaniel's smirk widened. One dinner. Sarah narrowed her gaze. But don't get any ideas, Blackwood. Nathaniel chuckled. Oh, sweetheart, he murmured, I already have plenty. Sarah's stomach flipped, because the way he said it made her very, very nervous. 15 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Nathaniel in a private dining room of an absurdly expensive restaurant, the kind where the waiters wore white gloves and the menus had no prices. She glared at him. You planned this, didn't you? Nathaniel took a sip of his wine, completely unbothered. I may have made a reservation, he admitted. Sarah groaned. You're insufferable. Nathaniel grinned. And yet, you're still here. Sarah ignored that. Instead, she picked up her menu, scanning it just to have something to do. But then, Nathaniel spoke again, and this time his voice was softer, more serious. You didn't ask me why. Sarah frowned. Why what? Why I wanted to have dinner with you. Sarah hesitated, then cautiously she set her menu down. All right, she said. Why? Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Because you're different. Sarah's breath caught. She wasn't expecting that, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. You treated me like a person before you knew who I was, he continued. You weren't after my money. You weren't trying to impress me. You just helped. Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say, because that was the closest thing to real honesty she had ever heard from him. And it scared her, because she wasn't ready for this, not yet. So instead of answering, she picked up her glass and took a slow sip of wine. Nathaniel watched her closely, and then, with a small, knowing smirk, he leaned back in his chair. You can fight this all you want, he murmured, but deep down you know it too. Sarah's pulse pounded. Because the worst part, he might be right, and that terrified her more than anything else. Section 10. Sarah had spent her whole life building walls that protected her, walls that kept people out, and yet somehow Nathaniel Blackwood had found a way to slip through the cracks. The dinner had been a disaster, not because of anything dramatic, no heated fights, no grand declarations, but because of something much worse. It had been easy, too easy. Sarah had laughed. She had let her guard down. For the first time in years, she had enjoyed someone's company without constantly second-guessing their motives. And that was dangerous because she couldn't afford to let him in. She couldn't afford to trust him. Because men like Nathaniel Blackwood, they didn't do forever, and Sarah had already learned that lesson the hard way. She avoided him for the next 2 days. No texts, no calls, no surprise visits outside her apartment. For the first time in weeks, she actually felt like she could breathe. But deep down, she knew it was only temporary, because Nathaniel wasn't the type to let things go. And sure enough, on the 3rd day, he showed up at her office unannounced. Sarah looked up from her desk, her heart jumping as she saw him standing in the doorway. Busy? he asked. Sarah exhaled sharply. What do you want, Blackwood? Nathaniel smirked. I need your opinion on something. Sarah narrowed her eyes. On what? Nathaniel walked forward, set a sleek black folder on her desk and slid it toward her. Sarah hesitated, then slowly opened it. Her breath caught, because staring back at her was an offer letter. An offer for her, a promotion, a position as his right hand, the kind of job people dreamed of. And for a long moment she couldn't speak. Sarah looked up, meeting Nathaniel's gaze. What is this? She asked carefully. Nathaniel leaned against the desk, watching her. It's what you deserve. Sarah's pulse pounded. You don't get to decide that. Nathaniel tilted his head. No, but I do get to recognize talent when I see it. Sarah clenched her jaw. Why are you doing this? Nathaniel didn't blink. Because you're wasted here. Sarah swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take the offer. But something didn't add up. And Nathaniel knew it. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. And maybe, he murmured, I just like having you around. Sarah's breath hitched. Because the way he said it, the way he looked at her, it wasn't professional, not at all. Sarah stood abruptly. She needed space, distance, anything to keep herself from falling into this trap. Look, she said, her voice steady. I appreciate the offer, but I don't mix business with… She hesitated. Nathaniel smirked. Business with what? Sarah glared at him. Don't start. Nathaniel chuckled, completely unbothered. Just say yes, Sarah. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to, but she was scared. Scared of what saying yes might mean. Scared of what she was feeling. So instead she shut the folder and looked him in the eye. No. Nathaniel went very, very still. For the first time his expression was completely unreadable. You're rejecting the offer? Sarah nodded. I am. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he straightened. All right. Sarah blinked. That was it? No argument, no pushing, just all right? She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Nathaniel left without another word, and Sarah told herself that was for the best. But deep down, it felt like she had just closed a door she might never be able to open again. And for the first time since meeting him, that thought terrified her. A week passed, then 2. And Nathaniel, he didn't call, didn't text, didn't even so much as look in her direction at work. And it hurt. It shouldn't have, but it did. She had pushed him away. She had said no. So why did it feel like she was the one who lost something? One night, after another miserable day, she went to her favorite coffee shop. She just needed a break, a moment to breathe. But when she stepped inside, her stomach dropped. Because there, sitting in the corner, was Nathaniel, with another woman. And Sarah? She had never felt so stupid. Of course he had moved on. Of course he had let go. That's what men like him did. So why did it hurt so much? Why did it feel like she was too late? She turned to leave, but before she could, Nathaniel's eyes lifted and locked onto hers. The moment their gazes met, Sarah's heart stopped. Because he wasn't smiling, he wasn't flirting, he wasn't even pretending. He looked angry, like he wasn't happy to see her, like she had just ruined something. And Sarah had no idea why. For the first time, she felt something ugly twist in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before, jealousy. And for the first time since meeting him, she had no idea what to do, because this wasn't part of the plan. Nathaniel Blackwood wasn't supposed to matter. But now she wasn't so sure. And that realization changed everything. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the comments.